But I want to go back to the issue of Ukraine now and the brave fight of the Ukrainian government and people to push back the Russian invaders. And I want to do it by referencing this article in The Spectator Australia. It's been written by our friend Pete Shmigel. We've spoken to a couple of times about this issue. And he points the finger at Amnesty International for trying to smear Ukraine with war crimes effectively as it tries to defend itself from the Russian invaders. Pete Shmigel joins me now on the desk. Thanks for joining us, Pete.
Good to be with you.
It's a classic case here, as you outline in your piece, that Amnesty International points out what the Russians have been doing, attacking civilian targets or whatever, but then they feel the need some weeks later or months later that they've got to point out some fault on the Ukrainian side.
It's really bizarre. Effectively what this report does is it gives a green light to Putin and his forces to kill and slay more civilians, because basically they say, look, wherever there's a Ukrainian civilian, you can count on the fact that there's some Ukrainian military there, and therefore it's a legitimate target. Go for your life. No coincidence that literally hours after Amnesty International issued this report, Russian diplomats were tweeting it out to the world as a way of giving themselves essentially cover for atrocities. Extraordinary. It
does seem extraordinary. So, yeah, they're saying this is, in many cases, armed militia resistance movement, as well as the armed forces of Ukraine trying to defend themselves. And by pointing out the proximity of civilians and weapons, the Russians they are given cover, an excuse for killing civilians, which they've been doing.
Yeah, well, look, it just completely ignores a physical, political and military reality, and that is you have an aggressor country that has invaded its neighbor. How do you defend yourself if you're not to stay on your own territory? It's almost nonsensical. At one point, the report makes the ludicrous suggestion that Ukrainian fighters should find some kind of empty fields from which to fire their weapons at the Russians. Look, and I think what we have to go to here is motive, and for mine, the international left has a lot to account for. The mockery that it's made of Amnesty International, a once great organization, is part of that. These people just have a blind spot when it comes to the Soviet Union and its successor state, Russia.
Well, this is the problem. Everybody would support the aims of Amnesty International, but they're so partisan. They don't want to be seen as defending the West, the capitalist West. Because in the same way, you don't see them criticising, for instance, Hezbollah for putting their weapons in the basement of hospitals in Gaza and the like. They just ignore that.
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
So I'm glad you've called it out and belled the cat, because the Ukrainian people need all the support, both intellectually and physically, to defend themselves. What's your latest on the situation on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, the balance is tipping. The West has committed an extraordinary amount of defensive equipment to Ukraine, properly, because it's in the defense, it's in the interest of the West to do so, not just Ukraine. And so what you see now is all sorts of Russian bases that were further away from the front lines now being taken out by HIMARS and howitzers and all sorts of long-range artillery that the Ukrainians have. They are very actively laying the groundwork for a new counterattack in the south, towards Kherson, which is the only major city that's been occupied by the Russians. So, in some respects, it's going to be a very long winter for the Russian occupiers of Ukraine as the Ukrainians move into a counterattack.
Now, there's a geostrategic argument that's increasingly being made about Ukraine, which I think is very helpful to the Ukrainian people. And it refers to Taiwan. And people are saying that if a lot of quite informed observers, I think most recently, including the former Foreign Minister for Australia, Alexander Downer, I used to work for, saying that if Russia is allowed to get away with annexing Ukraine without getting serious, effectively, war with the West, without being prevented from doing so, then that would be a green light to China and Taiwan. So it's important, in order to maintain the balance of power in East Asia, the West must make sure that Ukraine prevails. That helps Ukraine, doesn't it?
Very much so. We have an international legal principle of sovereignty.
Yeah.
And if we don't stand up for that legal principle of sovereignty, then China or anybody else who wants to play around in our own neighborhood has essentially an imprimatur to do so. If international legal frameworks don't matter, then big bad bullies will do whatever they like, be it China, be it Russia. So yeah, there is a lot at stake here that is more than just people that I happen to love.
Is Australia doing enough, and has there been enough continuity of that support since the change of government?
There has been. The position that Australia has taken, whether it was under the former government or under the current government, is so admired in Ukraine itself, because everybody recognises that Australia is punching well above its weight, $380 million worth of aid so far, highly targeted aid in terms of the type of equipment we've given and the type of support we've given. It's more than just the cute koala factor in Australia, in Ukraine. It's a recognition that this country actually does stand up on a bipartisan basis for things that matter, like sovereignty and democracy.
So it should. Thanks so much for joining us again, Pete.
Pleasure.
Pete Shmigel there. You can read his piece in The Spectator Australia.